maybe like a graph or a couple of charts. The sourcing for this is Historical Stats of the U.S., Colonial Times to Present. It's dated 1970, and you've got basically two graphs. You've got a graph on the left that illustrates cotton production between 1800 and 1860, and you've got a graph that charts growth of slavery between those same years. So looking at question 1, which of the following events influenced the changes in cotton production and slavery in the U.S. between 1800 and 1860, illustrated in the graphs above? Note that, again, your questions are almost always going to ask you to base your answer on the stimulus and on your knowledge of social studies. Okay? So this question is kind of asking you to rely both on the graph and your chart and your knowledge of social. Which of the following events influence the changes in cotton production? First of all, before we even look at the question, what's happening in both charts, in both graphs? You're seeing an increase in cotton production and you're seeing an increase in slavery. And if you look at that, it's between the same years in both graphs. What do you notice? Just comparison.
As the cotton production increases.
Between the two, the two graphs look very what?
Similar.
Yeah, they're almost identical in a lot of ways. Okay, so with that in mind, Alyssa, take a peek at question 1 if you would, and why is it not moving up? Let's look at 1. Which of the following events influenced the changes in cotton production and slavery in the U.S. between those years, illustrated in the graph above? What's the best choice? She chose 1. Okay? She chose 1, and that is absolutely the correct answer. That is the correct answer because 3/5 compromise was, when was the 3/5 compromise, by the way? Was that between 1800 and 1860? 3/5 compromise was at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Fugitive Slave Act was passed by Congress in 1850, and the Erie Canal. So there's a couple of answer choices clearly you could scratch from your choices. So good. Okay. The clear choice is based on the graph and on your knowledge of social studies. You knew Eli Whitney, Alyssa. You knew Eli Whitney, correct? Okay, that's kind of solves the riddle for you. Okay. Question 2. Now, question 2. This is why I always stress read all of the answer choices, because there's a couple of answer choices that are similar in scope. Question 2 asks, based on these graphs, what is one relationship between cotton production and the growth of slavery between 1800 and 1860? One relationship. Okay, 1, the number of slaves in the U.S. increased as cotton production grew. 2, the amount of cotton produced in the U.S. decreased as the number of slaves increased. 3, the number of slaves in the U.S. did not change much over time. Or D, or 4 rather, the amount of cotton produced in the U.S. changed more than the number of slaves. What's the best answer choice? 1. How many of you agree with 1? Good. 1 and 1 are the two correct answers. Okay. The only answer choice that could remotely be considered a possible answer choice is probably 4. Okay, the amount of cotton produced in the U.S. changed. Yes, it changed. It doesn't say up or down. When according to the chart, cotton went way up. Okay. Clearly, the amount of cotton produced in the United States does not decrease. This is why reading the question is vitally important. Now, we started the first marking period, or we started the second marking period this week. We're going to do a real easy chapter next week, chapter 12, Romance, Reform, and Religion. I need you to get chapter 12 read for Tuesday, if it's not read already. Chapter 12, get it read for Tuesday's class period. All right? We're going to spend a little bit of Monday on chapter 11. We won't get through chapter 11 today. That was my game plan originally, get through chapter 11 today, but we'll probably get through it on Monday. We're going to hop back into our slideshow from yesterday where we were talking about life in the South for whites. And if you guys could open up your slideshow to topic 11, slideshow 3, that would be much appreciated. If I could find mine here. So Southern white culture was where we left off, and if I'm not mistaken, we left off, I think, at the end of slide 2, possibly the end of slide 3. We were discussing Southern white culture not monolithic, okay? Southern whites were not all one class of people that were all considered equal. All Southern whites were not rich. All Southern whites were not slaveholders. There was varying degrees. But what did they hold in common? What was monolithic, Ava, among Southern whites? Despite the fact that there were different classes of white Southerners, what was a monolithic or a united belief that all whites had?
Higher up than slaves.
Correct. White Southerners, regardless of their social class, all would be considered above African American slaves, and this is why all whites fought and defended the right to what? Own slaves, whether they owned slaves or not. Okay? Let's look at the planter elite, okay? And talk a little bit about what the planter elite was like. We're on topic 11.3, slide 3, I believe, yes. The planter elite are going to be considered your wealthy landowners, and they own large plantations. Now, technically, anyone would be considered part of the planter elite if you own 20 or more slaves. You would be considered part of the upper crust of society if you own 20. But if the more slaves you owned, the more status and the more power you had in southern, in your southern community and in your southern, the state in which you lived. Most planters own 20 or more slaves. Some owned 50 or more, and the very, very wealthy are going to own hundreds or some even thousands of slaves.
Sorry for the interruption. Kaylee Granger, please report to the middle school office. Kaylee Granger, middle school office, please.
One thing I want to point out here is that your planter elite owned the majority of slaves, meaning the majority of slaves were owned by a handful of whites, okay? The majority of slaves were owned by a handful of whites. I don't want anybody leaving class today thinking that every white in the South was a slaveholder. That simply was not the case. You had a relatively small number of whites that owned large numbers of slaves, but it gave them very, very much influence in Southern society. Despite not being a large number of planter elite, they were very influential and they held very, very much power in Southern society. The planter elite maintained their economic style and lifestyle, and economic power and lifestyle through their influence and their the weight that they carried in the community based on the number of slaves that they owned. And they're constantly looking to expand their agricultural empire. Remember that as Americans are moving west in the mid-19th century, as Americans are moving west across the continent, what are Southerners looking to do, especially wealthy Southerners? They're looking to take their land, they're looking to take their slaves with them, and they're looking to basically, if they're in agriculture, they're looking to take those slaves to new lands and new territories. What is going to furnish the ability of large planters, large slaveholding planters? What invention is going to furnish them the opportunity to buy more land and more slaves? The cotton gin. The cotton gin is going to allow that to happen. Be able to process cotton much more quickly and much more efficiently is going to lead to the increased profits, which will allow Southern slaveholders to purchase more land and to purchase more slaves. Katie.
This is gonna be a silly question, but the iron plow, we were talking about it, does that have any impact on slavery, like expanding?
The iron plow. The iron plow is going to be replaced by the steel plow, and the steel plow will be much lighter than the iron plow. The steel plow will replace the iron plow. It will make it easier to farm. It will make it easier to cultivate land. Iron plows are not going to be very easy to maneuver by human beings. Iron plows are very, very heavy, and
I think I meant steel plow.
they tend to break. Steel plows will make agriculture in general easier, but it really will not have a large effect on slavery. It will. Let me take that back. There is a lot of cultivating necessary in growing cotton. So, to the extent that the steel plow will make cultivating soil easier, absolutely. Slaves will have an easier time if they're operating a plow, but most slaves, when it came to the cotton crop, most slaves are going to be most valuable to their masters when they're not so much planting, but when they are harvesting cotton, when they're picking cotton and basically getting that cotton ready to be sold to market. That's a good question. All right, the steel plow will replace the iron plow and make agriculture easier, not easy, but easier because of the weight of the device. And the steel plow will not nearly break as often as an iron plow will. All right. So the planter elite are looking to expand their agricultural empires, and as they expand their agricultural empires, this leads us to the question here that appears at the bottom of the page. I want to spend a moment on this. How did the planter elite's wealth impact their political influence? Well, as planters are buying more land and becoming more powerful and taking their slaves west with them, what's happening in those western territories that are not yet states where slavery is allowed in the South? What stage is being set? If you're a planter and you move across the Mississippi with hundreds of your slaves to a new territory, let's say Oklahoma, what is being established in new territories that might not have been established there 6 months before that? Slaves. And they're setting the precedent that if you bring slaves to new territories, that slavery will be allowed in those territories. And this is where the Northerners, Katie, we'll see you Monday, this is where the Northerners, especially the abolitionist wing in the North, are going to start screaming, holy hell, because Northerners by 1850, many Northerners are, even Northerners who are not looking to abolish slavery, many Northerners are looking to stop slavery from spreading, because if slavery spreads to new territories, if slavery is allowed to spread to new territories, Northerners are concerned about, one, more slaves is not good for, if you're an abolitionist, more slaves is not good because slavery is immoral, but many Northerners are arguing to stop slavery from spreading because they're concerned about losing political power. They're concerned about, if you allow slavery in these new territories, then ultimately the southern states and the slave states are going to outnumber the northern states or the free states, and the Northerners are scared of the prospect of losing political power. So the more land a slaveholder can purchase, the more land a slaveholder owns, that's going to equate to more political power and more wealth. So certainly there's a feeling among white Southerners that if we can move slavery west across the continent with the rest of our belongings, if we can move our furniture and we can move our families and we can move our hogs and we can move our cattle and we can bring everything that we own to the west with us, including our slaves, there's the feeling that slavery will be accepted in those new territories if the precedent is established. And this is why many Southerners are looking to expand west. One, the territory is ripe for farming, it's very fertile soil, and two, they're looking to increase their profits. They're looking to increase their profits. And what better way to do that than by moving into new territories? All right? Good point. All right, let's finish up what we can. Let's talk about what are called yeoman farmers. Now, we just looked at the planter elite, who are the wealthiest of the wealthy. Yeoman farmers, yeah.
So back to what you said about how like the Northerners were scared of losing power.
Yeah.
Wasn't there like a law or something passed that like when there was a new slave state, wasn't there a new free state as well?
Yeah. In 1820, with the Missouri Compromise, okay, in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, Maine is going to be added as a free state. Missouri is going to be added as a slave state. And that compromise will result in, between 1820 and the time the Civil War breaks out, every time there's going to be a new state added to the Union, they will be added in pairs, one free, one slave. And that balance will remain in effect until we get close to 1850 and beyond. But, and this is a huge but, when slaves were moved into areas that were not states, when slaves were moved into territories that were just considered American territories, North American territories, there were no restrictions on that. Okay, there were no restrictions on that regardless. With the exception, it had to be, if you were moving slaves into an American territory that wasn't a state, it had to be below 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude on the map. That was part of the Missouri Compromise. You couldn't bring slaves to new territories above 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude on the map. So if you wanted to expand westward across the continent and you owned slaves, you had to do it below that line of latitude. And it makes sense anyway, even if that law wasn't in effect, because if you're a farmer looking to expand your agriculture and looking to expand your land, why is it going to be pretty much considered automatic that your land is going to be below 36 degrees latitude on the map? Better soil and a more conducive what? Think Florida, think South Carolina, think Georgia. The climate is going to be much more conducive to long-term farming, long-season farming. So, good question too. Small independent farmers are going to be your yeoman farmers. These are going to be men and women who own typically one or two, or most didn't own any slaves. Yeoman farmers were simple, small independent farmers, typically owned few or no slaves. They supported slavery for the reasons we've discussed. Okay, they aspired to become slave owners themselves. This was the kind of the gold standard for a yeoman farmer. They would look at a planter. They would look at a white planter who owned 30 slaves and looked at his mansion and looked at his wealth and his affluence. They saw the BMWs in the driveways. They saw the slave quarters, and they aspired to that. They wanted to become part of that lifestyle. A lot in the same way that America today, Americans who are born of simple means work and save and scrimp and plan and bust their humps. Why? Because eventually Americans want to be able to say that they've accomplished homeownership. They've accomplished being able to get married, being able to go to college. All those things are signs of Americans' desire to increase their station in life, or increase their class in society. Same thing here for yeoman farmers. Yeoman farmers, they want to arrive someday, and arrival in this period of time is going to be the ownership of slaves. That status is going to be something that they yearn. They want to aspire to become slave owners, and they also feared competition from free labor. They feared competition. If slaves were freed, and by free labor we don't mean not paying people. This term free labor here means if slaves were freed in large numbers all at once, yeoman farmers would be concerned, because now they would be competing with former slaves for what? for jobs. They would be competing with former slaves for jobs. This is exactly why many Northerners are going to oppose abolition during this period. Northerners, now there's going to be many who support abolition in the North. Many Northerners are going to oppose abolition on the grounds that if millions of slaves are freed and they come north, what will happen to the job market in the North if millions of former slaves enter the job market? They'll be competitive. It'll be much more competitive for work. So that's going to be a motivation as well. Good, Alyssa. So they feared competition from free labor. And I want to ask you, how do you think yeoman farmers' aspirations affected their views on slavery? If you were, Dylan, if you were a simple farmer who owned no slaves and you were breaking your back, how might that affect your aspirations and your views on slavery? Would you look at slavery as if you looked at the wealth that whites had accumulated in the South, would that affect your views on the ownership of slaves, do you think?
Well, I think if you're like one of those poorer farmers, you're aspirating to be like one of those rich farmers, so you're working hard enough to buy your own slaves to work on and just keep going up.
Absolutely. Slavery, we look at slavery today in 2024, we look at it, I certainly look at it as a moral issue. I mean, the immorality of owning another human being, of restricting rights of another human being, of preventing another human being from marrying, of preventing another human being from being with their family, of preventing another human being from voting, participating in society. Southern whites during this period looked at slavery not as a moral issue, they looked at it as an economic issue. And one of the reasons they're able to look at it as an economic issue and not a moral issue is because slaves were, this is very simple, but it's something that we need to state. Slaves were dehumanized. If you can dehumanize a slave, take away their humanity, it's going to be a lot easier for human beings to justify owning something that is not a human being. So many Southern whites are not going to look at slavery as immoral. They're going to look at slavery as just their right to own a piece of property. That will be, we talk about monolithic, we talk about was the South monolithic. I used the term yesterday, universal in the South. You know, universal means everyone and everybody. And clearly, when you're talking about the South, there's probably 9 million Americans living in the South during this period, about 9-10 million Americans, white and black combined. It's tough for me to stand here today, 190 years, 180 years later, and say every white Southerner supported slavery. There's always going to be a lot. Whenever we're talking history, you can really never say never. There's always going to be an exception. But that said, the reason slavery was universally accepted by whites, with few exceptions, is because it was not seen as a moral issue, it was seen as an economic issue. And it was seen as an economic issue because slaves were dehumanized. I had this chat with my 7th graders yesterday and today, reading an excerpt from Frederick Douglass's autobiography, which we will work on next week. We're going to look at a quick snippet from one of his autobiographies. Frederick Douglass writes in the very first chapter of his very first autobiography, he doesn't know his birthday because it was never told him. And he said he never knew a slave in his life who knew his birthday. Ms. Brentsville, what do you got?
I was just wondering, can our little friend come to Twilight Zone tonight?
As long as he's not on AT and as long as you're okay with that. I mean, if you're okay with him coming here, even though he was kind of a moron to you today, I'm
How
okay.
was he during the...
He was fine. He
He was
did
good?
what
Okay,
I
that's
asked him
all,
to do.
yep. Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Yep. Where was I?
That he didn't, their country...
Douglass didn't know his birth date, and he writes that not only did he not know his birthday, he never knew a slave who knew his exact birth date. And my students are like, well, why? And I was trying not to give them the answer without them thinking about it a little bit, and I finally got them thinking, and Who celebrates a birthday? Human beings. What makes us unique, what makes us special is we all have a different birthday. And if you're a slave and you're considered a piece of property, why in the world would a slaveholder remind or celebrate or even acknowledge the date of birth of this young man or this young woman who is considered a piece of property? And when we talk about dehumanizing, there is absolutely nothing more dehumanizing than not acknowledging a human being's birthday. I mean, that's something we all have. Think about it. Other than our name, the most personal thing we all possess is when we were born. We all know it. We all take it for granted. We all feel kind of special when that day rolls around. Frederick Douglass lived until 1895, and he died not knowing when he was born, and he died not knowing what day of the month was his birthday. Now, we have a feeling it was February, and we have a feeling it was 1818, but it's ballpark because there were no written records. Dehumanized. This is why slavery is not really considered a moral issue among white Southerners during this period. It's considered an economic issue because slaves were property. Okay, any questions, comments? Blake?
Go back and forth.
I thought you were going to ask me something really profound. Yeah, you can use the shitter. Go ahead. All right, pardon my French. All right. Every once in a while I have a really, really meaningful moment in class. Blake, you might want to hold up for just a sec. Every once in a while we have a nice, meaningful conversation in class about a topic of like vital importance. And when I see a hand go up, okay, I get kind of goosebumpy because I feel I'm going to get a question that's, So Blake, yeah, you can use the bathroom. Go ahead. All right. You didn't break my heart too bad. All right. You know what I mean? It's like I thought he was into it. Go bathroom. Yeah, go ahead. All right. Anyway, next. Poor whites. So yeoman farmers were a step above poor whites on the social scale. Poor whites are at the bottom. These are going to be landless laborers or subsistence farmers. Landless laborers, people who don't own land and who work as laborers. And subsistence farmers, people who either own a small piece of land or rent a piece of land and are farming for subsistence, meaning they're farming just to feed themselves, okay, and their family. Poor whites rarely own slaves, okay? And again, just like the last slide, why did yeoman farmers support slaves? We give the reasons. Now we're going to look at why poor whites supported slavery. Okay, poor whites support slavery again because it helped them maintain superiority over enslaved people. It helped them maintain superiority over enslaved people. If I am a poor white man living in South Carolina and I don't have a nickel to my name, I can be guaranteed, as long as slavery exists, that I will be considered, on the social scale at least, I will be considered above an African-American slave, just by virtue of the fact that my skin color is white and the slave skin color is black. So poor whites are going to maintain racial superiority over enslaved people. This is why they support it. And also to that aspiration, that hope that one day they can achieve economic advancement, that one day their ship might arrive or their ship might sail in and, through hard work or through perseverance, and maybe a little bit of luck, they might one day be able to own slaves themselves. And this is important because these ideas are passed from generation to generation. So white Southerners are going to be think about this for a second. Think about how many of you, curious, boy or girl, guys or gals, how many of you have had your parents or your grandparents or any adult in your life, how many of you have had your loved ones drop hints to you about what they hope for you to accomplish in the future or what they hope you will achieve in the future, where you'll go to college, who you'll marry, what type of man you'll marry, or what type of woman how many of you have had those types of little subtle hints dropped about what expectations are for you in the future? Show of hands if we've seen that, okay? Parents want what's best for their kids. And white Southerners during this time period are going to want their children to be better off than they were. So if you were a poor white Southerner, you're not going to have a heck of a lot of education. You're not going to have a formal education. You're not going to have a heck of a lot of opportunity for work outside agriculture. So your hope is that you can one day be in a position to purchase a slave or to purchase multiple slaves to increase your station or your standing in Southern life. And we'll go back to our topic from a moment ago. Why might poor whites feel threatened by abolition? Poor whites are also going to be frightened to death of the abolition of slavery, because with the job market, and if slaves were filled en masse in large numbers all at once, you're going to have many white Southerners just be petrified of the consequences of that, about the opening up of job opportunities to literally millions of former slaves. That would be too much for white Southerners to handle. Just the thought of that would cause trepidation and fear on the parts of whites. So poor whites, middle class whites, upper class whites, they're all connected in the sense that they all support slavery, whether or not they own slaves, for the reasons we've enumerated today. All right? Let's go to the next slide, number 6. Urban professionals and merchants. Again, we're talking white Southern society. You do have some professionals, and you do have a merchant class in the South outside of agriculture. You have lawyers, doctors, shopkeepers, and businessmen. Now, it's not going to be anything like industry in the North, but it will be industry nonetheless. You often have them living in cities and towns. Again, we're talking urban professionals and merchants. They supported expansion. They exported slavery as expansion because their businesses depended on the slave-based economy. Their businesses depended on the slave-based economy. I'll give you a simple example before the bell. If I am a doctor in the South, I'm a physician, a general practitioner, and I see 20 patients a week. If I'm a doctor and I am seeing, as my regular group of patients, a group of slave-owning whites, those slave-owning whites and their children and their grandchildren are my regular patients that I see. I am going to want my slave-holding patients to be able to pay me and to be able to continue having me as their doctor, and the only way that I'm going to be able to do that is if those people are what? If I'm a slave-holding patient of a doctor, that doctor is going to want me to be a successful slaveholder, so he can what? So he can make a profit. Doctor might not own slaves, but he's getting wealthy on my success as a slaveholder. Absolutely.
I'll see you later. Have a good day.
Good night, Eva. Or good night, Ava.